Well, this is the first of the tutorials for 2022. A nice single tree, a nice easy tutorial that will get us back into the groove. You're going to start with a big flat, you're going to start with a number 4, you're going to start with a rigger and a very fine liner. I also used my wisp brush at the end to splatter, but you could certainly use a fan brush for that splattering also. A few colors that we're going to use today. First, we were going to be using cerulean blue for part of our sky. We'll be using indigo blue. We will be using some turquoise, just a very small amount of turquoise, and you could probably even do without that if you don't have it. And we're also using black. For our brighter colors, especially in the sky area, I used my cadmium red. We're also going to be using some alizarin crimson. We will be using cadmium yellow to make our peach color. And we'll be using sap green. I also used a very, very, very small amount of burnt umber, not even enough to show you. You'll be using salt. And if your sketch does not have what mine does, you may want to sketch in just parts of your tree so that you know where your bigger branches are, and then also your horizon line and the different sections of the field. There's a few sections, not just one. We're going to start off with wetting our sky, and you're going to wet the entire sky area. You can go over your tree because that will be much darker, so it doesn't matter. And you want to wet your paper all the way to the top. It doesn't have to be forming a puddle, but it should be nice and wet so that when you lift your paper to blend your colors, they will run smoothly and won't hit any rough, raw edges. I started off with a peach color that I got by mixing my cadmium yellow and a little bit of my alizarin crimson. And I put that color at the baseline. Now, of course, you can be using any colors for your sky. If you don't want a sunset sky or a sunrise sky, you could simply use your cerulean blue or cerulean blue and black to make steel gray, or it could be all pinks and purples. It's up to you. But I started with my peach color, and then above my peach color, I put in my alizarin crimson. You want to move your paper around a little bit to allow that color to blend and bleed together. So I hold it both upright and to the left and to the right so that the water moves in all directions, and that's what will soften your color for you. And then you will get a nice soft pastel sky. Once your color has settled and it's still wet, the key is it must be still wet. I added in some alizarin crimson with the edge of my big flat brush, kind of like just streaks in the sky of color. Again, it's nice and wet, and I'm holding my paper up again, left to right, up and down, so that I get that nice soft bleed, that beautiful blend. You can continue to add colors to your sky like that as long as you are really nice and wet. As soon as it starts to dry, you don't want to be adding colors because then you're going to get a washback. You don't want to get a washback in your sky. So you want to make sure that you are really, really wet before you add additional colors in. The minute that it starts to dry is the time when you need to stop adding color. Now that doesn't mean that you can't add color ever again, but you have to wait till your sky is totally dry, and I would wait a few hours. Then you can re-wet the sky and add those colors in. But I would not try to do that if your sky is starting to dry. You want to wipe off your table so you don't get a washback from any water that's on your table, and then you want to allow that to dry really well. Now while that's drying, or after that's drying, whatever you prefer, I'm wetting the front section of my picture because that's where I'm going to put in a lot of my blues for my nice shadowy snow. The foreground snow is going to show a lot of texture, whereas the layers of field in the background won't show as much texturing. So this nice front section, I wet the whole section. I'm not painting in the whole section though. I'm allowing some of those sections to remain white. So I'm just using the edge of my nice big brush to go ahead and put those blue colors in, and I used just my cerulean blue. Wipe your table always if you have any water that gets on your table, because you do not want washback, and it will come back in on your table or on your paper from your table. I'm also adding a little bit of salt, and if your sky area is still wet, you need to be very careful where you're salting so that you don't get salt up in your sky. If your sky is still wet, you can go ahead and salt, but what I do is I'll hold a piece of paper or an envelope or something in front of my sky. Don't lay it on your sky. Hold it in front of your sky to keep any of that salt from going in that direction. Now, believe it or not, my sky is still really, really wet. So I'm going to add some additional color. You can see from the shine on my paper how wet my sky still is, and that's perfectly fine. But I feel that it's safe enough that I can still add in some darker color, some blue into my sky, because I am definitely still wet enough. If you have any doubts whatsoever, then I would not do this. I would wait until it totally dried, and then just re-wet it with water, and you can add your colors in. Don't take a chance if you think for any reason whatsoever that you are already dry or almost dry, because once your paint starts to dry and you change that ratio of paint and water, you will get a washback, which will be like a big water spot in your sky. While my snow is still wet, at the base of where my tree is, I am adding in a little bit of that umber mixed with some black. And I'm just dry brushing or painting that up into the very base of my tree trunk. And again, I'll allow that to dry really well. Now my painting is really dry. I've removed most of my salt from the bottom, and I'm going to go back up in, and I'm going to add my trees in the distance. So I'm going to re-wet my sky, but I'm only going to re-wet about a third of the way up. I'm not going to re-wet the whole sky because my background trees aren't going to be going up that far. It's very important that your sky is totally dry before you do this, because if it's not totally dry, it will give you a washback, because the paper is rag, so it might feel dry to the touch, but it might still be wet on the inside. So if you re-wet it and it re-wets that damp inside, it's going to produce a washback line for you. So if you are concerned in any way, either dry it really well with a hair dryer or let it dry on its own for at least a few hours. So I'm re-wetting that area. I'm dropping in my little bit of umber with some black, and I'm going to allow that to bleed upward. So when I lift my paper, I want to, of course, lift it in that direction so that it bleeds into the wet part of my paper and I get a nice soft edge on my tree line. I'm going to do my tree line the whole way across my paper, and I want to make sure that I have different heights to my trees. I don't want my trees to all be one height. So you want to make sure that you might be adding a little bit more paint here and there so that it'll travel a little bit farther and give you different heights to your trees. Before that would dry then, I'm going to put a little bit of salt on the tops of my trees because I want a little bit of texturing to those trees. And then I will let it dry. After it's dry, you can go ahead and remove that salt. I went ahead and drew in the roof to a barn that is over the hill. I wasn't going to put that in, but then I changed my mind, so I went ahead and drew that roof in so that I could have something else in all of those snow mounds, snow hills. I'm putting in some shadowing along that far tree line because there's going to be a lot of trees back in there, which will of course produce shadow in the snow. So rather than trying to do little individual shadows, I'm just going to shadow that whole hill with a little bit of indigo mixed with some cerulean blue, and then I'm going to soften the edge of that with some water and allow that to dry. Then I'm going to move to this front hillside. This is the hill that kind of goes down to where the barn would be. So I want to give it a little bit of shape. It's not flat. It's a rounded hillside that's going to go down into like a valley area. So I'm arching my shadow to give it a roundness feel. And just by doing that with your paintbrush, you will visually see the roundness to that. Same coloring, cerulean with a little bit of indigo. And then I'm making it look a little bit rougher on that left-hand side, not solid. So I'm just kind of moving my paintbrush around, kind of making it look like there's a lot of footsteps and footprints that might be walking over that side of the hillside. And again, I will let that dry really well then. Once it's dry, I'm going to be mixing a little bit of sap green with some black because I'm going to be putting evergreens in. So I'm making it look as though there are a row of evergreens on one of the sections of my hillside or my land or my fields. So I'm just dry brushing in on one of those sections a nice straight line of some rough sap mixed with some black, just a little bit here and there. And then my next step will be drawing in all of my pine tree stumps, not my limbs, but my actual tree, so that I know where to add all of the greenery. So I'm just going to put in all of my trunks. They're going to be done with a rigger because these are in the distance, so you're not going to have a nice thick tree trunk there. You're going to have nice thin lines. Some are close together, some are farther apart, some are back in the distant trees, some are in the more foreground fields. There are none in the very foreground, only that one big singular tree. So these are just in the other fields that are already over the hill. And I'm just using black for that, nice thin lines all the way across my paper. Have them very uneven in spacing. You don't want to have one every 1/4 inch because this isn't a landscaped driveway. You know, this is just a big open field. Then back where I have my distant trees, I'm still using my rigger, but of course you could revert to a smaller number 2 brush if you wanted to. And I am still using my sap and black, but now I'm making some trees that are way back in the distance. So with my rigger, I am just going from left to right, and I'm putting in the branches. They'll be longer at the base, left to right, and as you get towards the top, then they'll be much shorter. So it doesn't matter where you start. You can start at the top or you can start at the bottom, and you're just going to go left to right. And you'll get a nice pine tree out of that. Not a lot of detail. You don't need a lot of detail in these trees because they are in the distance. You're not seeing, you know, a lot of individual branches. You're not certainly seeing pine cones or pine needles. These are way off in the distance. So everywhere where you have a tree trunk, you have to have, you know, your greenery. Now, you have some tree trunks that are nice and close together, so you could probably, you know, take in 2 or 3 of those tree trunks just by making one tree and maybe a couple different tops. But you don't have to do every single individual tree. You'll be doing that the entire way across, including all of the trees that would be in the midground. Same way, just go left to right with your rigger. If you need to practice that first, practice that on a plain piece of paper until you get the hang of it. But it's very simple. Just put your rigger down and push it left to right, left to right, left to right, all the way to the top of your tree trunk. Once you're done with all of your trees, of course they're going to dry nicely. And now I painted in the roof to my barn. I used that tiny little bit of turquoise mixed with some sap green for the color to the top of my barn, my roof of my barn. But you could, of course, use any color. You could use umber, or you could even make it a red roof. But I didn't want my roof to stand out that much, so I just went with a nice turquoise mixed with a little bit of sap green. Once that's painted in, that is all I'm going to be doing to that roof. I'm not going to try to roughen it up with dry brushing, nothing. It's too far in the distance. It's just simply painted in. Now I'm going to begin the painting of my big main tree. I used mainly black for that. You can mix in some burnt umber, but we're going to be painting in some branches separately. We don't want to do them all at the same time. So I painted the very front to my tree first. I left one of the branches in the middle of my tree trunk not painted so that I would see a difference between that branch that seems to be jutting out in front of me versus all of the other ones. So I painted some of my tree trunk and branches, allowed that to dry, then painted additional ones, allowed those to dry, until I was done with all of the big main branches. I'm not talking about the little tiny branches. I'm talking about the big main branches, and there's probably, 9 or 10 of those. I did salt the main trunk and some of the main branches, but again, I did not salt every single one of them. So you can pick and choose where you'd like to put your salting. But you want to make sure that this tree trunk is nice and dark in color so that it really stands out in your picture. Continue painting them until they are all painted. And remember, your branches don't simply go straight up. They have elbows. Some are broken, so they will come back towards the ground. Some go, straight off to the left or to the right. You want to move your branches around. You can give your tree shape. However, you don't want all of the branches to be going in one direction. So make sure that you move your branches around and that you do have a nice shape to your tree before you start worrying about the smaller branches. I made sure that my tree looked like a big open V before I started putting in my secondary branches. Now, when I am ready to put in my secondary branches, I am going to be putting them in with my number 2 round, my rigger, and also my very fine liner. My fine liner will be for the really teeny tiny branches, and I will use that fine liner to kind of squiggle around to fill in some areas with really fine little branches. And you will see as I begin to do that how easily it is to fill some of those sections in just by squiggling and moving your brush around in all directions. So now I'm starting with my rigger, and again, I want to create a shape to my tree. I don't want my branches to just go everywhere. I also don't want to lose my beautiful sky. So you want to be sure that you're putting your branches in, but you also want to be sure that you have your beautiful sky left. So you don't want to fill in your entire, paper from halfway over to the edges with your tree that is so full of branches and sticks that you don't see your beautiful sky. So kind of plan what you're doing. I'm using both my real fine liner and my rigger, and I'm going to complete both sides. I did my left side first, and then I'll move to my right side. That doesn't mean that that's how you have to do it. If you want to go back and forth, left to right, that's certainly fine. But you can see too how I have some of my branches bent and coming back down towards the snow. Some broken branches, some lower branches. They don't all have to be straight up in the air. You want that to go out in all directions. You can always go back to your tree and put in more branches. So I would say less is better in the very beginning. Do some. If it looks full enough to you, great. And then you can move on. But you can always come back and add branches. You can add branches next week, next month, next year, but you can't take them off. So you want to know when to stop, when it's enough. When you're happy with your tree, then we're going to start to put some footprints in our snow. The footprints are just done with your number 2 or your number 4 round, and you're just kind of flopping it on your paper with some watered down indigo. You're not actually drawing footprints. You're just flopping your brush around to give the essence of a lot of footprints going through the snow. You can have your pathways going in any direction. You can have them crisscrossing or just simply going straight up to the tree. You can have them going past the tree. You can have one path, you can have 2 paths, whatever. But again, don't overdo. When that is totally dry, we're going to put in our shadow to the tree. The shadow is off to the right. I used my indigo mixed with some black, and it comes from the base of the tree, and it goes straight off to your right, to the edge of the paper. I also added in a few branches, but those branches I did not have come towards me. I want them to simply go to the right of the paper. I don't want any coming towards me because I want that shadow of that tree to stay as a shadow that's going off to the right. If you have those shadowed lines coming down towards you, that would mean that your tree is probably 30 feet wide, and I really don't think that's the case. So you want to make sure that your shadowed lines are going off to your right. I also added a couple little twigs coming out of the snow, just with some watered down umber and black. And not too many, but I thought a couple would just break up all of that nice snow that's in the front there. But you don't have to do that at all if you don't want to. I also used the side of my rigger with a little bit of the tree trunk color and dirtied up my snow slightly here and there, but not a lot, and I kept it towards the base of my tree. Now I'm using my little wisp brush. You could use your fan brush for this. I'm using just my indigo mixed with my black, my shadow color, and I'm just doing a little bit of splatter in my snow. This is optional. If you want to do that, you can. If you don't want to do that, you don't have to. However, don't overdo it with the splattering. Now the very last thing is, in my distance, all of those trees, they also are creating shadows in the snow. So I'm using my shadow color, and just at the base of the tree trunks that you can see, I'm just doing a straight line of indigo. And that is the shadow that those big trees are producing in the snow. Shouldn't take you very long to do that. You don't have to do every individual tree trunk. You can do a few at a time, just with a line of indigo. This was a nice, easy one to ease us back into the painting. I know sometimes when you're away from it for a little while, you need to ease back into it, like riding a bike. You don't want to take that 20-mile bike ride first time back. So we're just easing our way into it. But this one will definitely prepare you for next week's video. So pay special attention to these nice trees. Pay special attention to the sky. Next week we're going to be doing another one, a little bit more difficult though. Enjoyed this painting. Don't enjoy the snow, but enjoyed the painting. Happy painting to you all. Welcome back.